So the formula for compound interest is this thing. This tells you what the new amount is after 5%, for instance. That could be R, 5% there, over a particular number of years of time. The formula is fine, but you really do need to understand where it comes from, particularly in IGCSE. In WIAC, you can just use it and learn it. But it comes from this idea of multiplication factors, so that if you increase something by 2%, that's the same as multiplying by 1.02. If you increase something by 10%, you multiply by 1.10. So that amount there should be 1.10. Yeah, 1.10, because it's 10%. 10% added to 100. So that if you have, for instance, 100 and you add 10% to it, you get a factor of 1.10, because remember that a percentage is over 100. So if you decrease something by 8%, it means you start with 100 and you take away 8, you get 92, and that's 92 out of 100. So this idea of multiplication factors is central to IGCSE questions, because they often ask you to go backwards to what was it, not what is the new one here, but what was it before the increase. So let's just take an example of how that formula builds up. If you increase something by 5% for 3 years, it's like multiplying by 1.05, then 1.05 again, and then 1.05 again. That's an increase of 5% for 1, 2, 3 years. You could write that, obviously, in index form, 1.05 to the power of 3. So matching that up to the formula, the new principal is the old principal times by 1 plus 5 over 100 to the power of 3. Or these two things are the same. The formula and the multiplication factor is exactly the same. You get the same answer whichever way you use. The advantage of the formula, of course, is that it's straightforward to use one way. It's not necessarily easy to use backwards. So let's look at a backwards question. Backwards question means if after 5 years the amount that you have is £100 and you started with £80, and the question might ask you what was the annual compound interest rate. So at an IGCSE level, you can write down the answer in this form straight off, that the rate is the fifth root, because you're going over 5 years, of the new amount divided by the old amount, so 100 divided by 80, because that's the multiplication factor. That's how 80 changes to 100. And then you take the fifth root of it, and that gives you this 1.0456 carrying on. And therefore, because you know that the multiplication factors is what you're dealing with, the percentage increase is 4.56%. Now that is how an IGCSE A-star student would lay out the work. If you want to do it by the WIAC method, which is more pedantic, if you like, it needs to show all your steps. The new principal is 100, the old principal is 80, your formula is 1 plus r over 100 to the power of 5. And you need to work out what r is. So you've got these steps through solving this equation, and it's really important that you don't do any button pressing on your calculator until the last minute. So here, for instance, you divide through by 80, so 100 divided by 80 is 1 plus r over 100 to the power of 5. To inverse this to the power of 5, you take the fifth root. So the fifth root of 100 over 80 is equal to 1 plus r over 100. And then taking away 1 from both sides, you get the fifth root of 100 over 80, take away 1 is equal to r over 100. And now to simplify the right-hand side, you're going to multiply it all the way through by 100. So grouping this as one thing on your calculator, remember, put some extra brackets around it, multiply by 100, will give you the rate. And if you do that on the calculator, you get 4.56%, which is exactly the same as doing it by this method. This method, for instance, has all of the steps that you've done here built into it. So that's how a typical IGCSE backwards question works. And they often do this. They're not interested in the simple use of the formula. They're really trying to get you to understand the difference of how you work backwards.